Imagine this: you're walking through a bustling ancient marketplace, the air rich with unfamiliar but tantalizing scents. A pungent aroma wafts from a weathered wheel of cheese resting on a wooden slab. Nearby, a vendor stirs a bubbling clay pot of tangy, fermented cabbage. Down the alley, someone is pouring frothy beer into a clay cup, its golden fizz catching the sun. These smells might seem funky, strange, even off-putting to the modern nose. But to ancient peoples, they were the aromas of life, survival, community, and power. Now, what if I told you that these seemingly humble fermented foods, the aged cheese, the sour sauerkraut, and that ancient brew, were more than just menu items? They were, in fact, the building blocks of entire civilizations. These foods weren't just about flavor, they were about function. They preserved nutrition in an era without refrigeration. They prevented disease by promoting gut health long before anyone knew what a microbe was. They served as currency, fuel, medicine, and even sacred offerings. Empires fed their soldiers with them, priests used them in rituals, and entire communities gathered around their creation and consumption. Fermentation was a quiet revolution, a biological alchemy that transformed raw ingredients into something not only edible but powerful. Across continents and cultures, fermented foods helped connect people through trade, shaped regional identities, and even saved lives when other food sources failed. In a very real sense, they fermented more than just food, they fermented history. Welcome to a world where every bite tells a story, a world where food is more than sustenance, it's a living archive of human ingenuity. This is the captivating crossroads of cuisine and history, where pots and pans collide with scrolls and ruins, and where humble meals whisper the secrets of ancient civilizations. Today, we're diving headfirst into one of the most fascinating and transformational culinary practices ever developed by humankind: fermentation. At first glance, it might seem counterintuitive. Why would anyone willingly allow food to sit, to sour, to fizz or curdle? But thousands of years ago, long before anyone could explain bacteria or write down a recipe, our ancestors stumbled upon a discovery that would forever change the course of human survival and culture. Before the luxury of refrigerators, preservatives, or scientific food safety protocols, ancient communities had to get creative. They learned through observation, trial, and maybe even a few stomach aches, that under the right conditions, what looked like spoilage was actually a miraculous transformation. Grains turned into beer, milk into cheese, cabbage into sauerkraut. And what seemed like a gamble with rot became a powerful way to make food last longer, taste better, and sometimes even heal the body. Fermentation became more than just a culinary trick, it became a cornerstone of civilization. It preserved the harvest, fed armies, inspired spiritual rituals, and built the very foundation of traditional cuisine still savored today. This ancient technique, born of necessity, grew into an art and a science long before either word existed. Fermentation wasn't just an early form of culinary cleverness, it was a lifeline. A fundamental survival tool that turned fleeting harvests into year-round nourishment, and spoiled perishables into precious resources. But beyond survival, fermentation found its way into the deepest layers of human culture. It became embedded in spiritual practices, in community traditions, and in the very social fabric that held ancient societies together. In ancient Mesopotamia, for example, beer wasn't simply a drink, it was divine. Rituals were built around its brewing, with hymns dedicated to Ninkasi, the goddess of beer, blending sacred praise with practical instructions. This wasn't just food, it was faith in liquid form. Thousands of miles away and thousands of years later, in Korea, families dug special storage caves to ferment kimchi, an act that was as much about cultural identity as it was about nutrition. These weren't just meals, they were multi-generational legacies. Fermented foods carried stories, superstitions, healing properties, and even social roles. In many cultures, to know how to ferment was to hold knowledge that ensured the survival and prosperity of your people. It was alchemy, an invisible transformation that mystified the mind and nourished the body. Fermented foods were believed to balance the body's energies, cleanse the spirit, and even ward off illness. It was medicine, myth, and magic, all wrapped in the humble skin of a cabbage leaf or hidden in a bubbling crock. So before we dive any deeper, take a moment. Grab that tangy yogurt, that fizzy kombucha, that crumbly blue cheese. Because this is no ordinary culinary exploration. This is a time-traveling taste test through the annals of history, culture, and human resilience. And by the end of it, you may never look at your fermented favorites the same way again. Let's rewind the clock, way back, to one of the cradles of civilization, ancient Mesopotamia, around 7000 BCE. Nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, this region was more than just fertile land for crops, it was fertile ground for human innovation. And among the most remarkable discoveries to bubble up from this ancient soil was one of humanity's oldest and most beloved fermented creations, beer. This wasn't the kind of drink we imagine today, neatly bottled and chilled. Early Mesopotamian beer was thick, porridge-like, and unfiltered, consumed through long straws from communal vessels. But don't let the rustic appearance fool you. This drink held power. Fermentation, whether fully understood or not, offered something priceless: safety. In a time when water sources could easily be tainted with pathogens, beer, mildly alcoholic and boiled during brewing, was often safer to drink than water itself. But beer wasn't just about hydration, it was the fuel of civilization. Laborers who built the temples and ziggurats of Mesopotamia were often paid in beer rations. It became a kind of liquid currency, traded, taxed, and treasured. Beer wasn't just sustenance, it was social structure in a jug. Even the divine had a taste for it. Beer played a central role in religious life. Ancient texts like the hymn to Ninkasi don't just praise a deity, they encode the process of brewing in verse, preserving a sacred recipe. Beer flowed in temples, offerings were made to gods in foaming mugs, and feasts featured this fermented drink as a symbol of blessing and abundance. In Mesopotamia, fermentation wasn't merely a happy accident, it was a cornerstone of society. A single bubbling brew connected health, labor, economy, and religion. And in that golden fizz, we find the beginnings of how fermented foods would go on to shape every corner of the ancient world. Now picture this, in ancient Sumer, one of the earliest civilizations in Mesopotamia, beer was held in such high regard that it wasn't just brewed, it was worshipped. The Sumerians revered a goddess named Ninkasi, the divine brewer, the one who fills the mouth with joy. She wasn't a minor deity tucked away in a forgotten corner of their pantheon. Ninkasi was front and center in their daily lives, her influence bubbling up with every batch of beer. And here's where it gets even more fascinating, the Sumerians didn't just brew beer, they sang to it. One of the oldest known surviving pieces of writing is the hymn to Ninkasi, an ode to the goddess that doubles as a fully functional brewing recipe. It's part prayer, part instruction manual, a poetic blend of devotion and domestic skill. Written in cuneiform on clay tablets, the hymn describes the brewing process from start to finish, preserving not just a method, but a worldview where making beer was a sacred act. Can you imagine that? Waking up at dawn, crushing barley, and heating water, all while chanting verses in praise of a goddess, because each batch wasn't just a drink, it was a divine offering. The very act of brewing became a spiritual ritual, one that connected the earthly and the divine through bubbling vats and aromatic steam. It's a striking reminder of just how deeply food, faith, and daily life were entwined in the ancient world. And it shows us that fermentation wasn't just about preserving calories, it was about preserving culture, memory, and meaning. Now, let's journey from the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia to the golden sands of ancient Egypt, where the story of fermentation takes on monumental proportions, literally. In this land of pharaohs and pyramids, fermented bread and beer weren't just food and drink, they were daily essentials, spiritual offerings, and the very fuel that powered one of the greatest architectural feats in human history. Imagine the bustling construction sites of the Giza Plateau. Thousands of laborers, stonecutters, haulers, and artisans, working under the blazing sun. What kept them going? It wasn't just grit and determination. It was rations of fermented bread and beer, distributed daily. Beer wasn't a luxury for the elite, it was a nutritional staple for the workers who quite literally built the empire. Rich in calories, safer than water, and easier to digest, this thick, soupy beer was packed with nutrients that kept laborers energized through grueling days. And the bread? It wasn't just a side dish. Egyptian bread, leavened with wild yeasts caught from the air, was among the earliest examples of naturally fermented food. Bakers would set aside a portion of dough, what we now call a starter, to rise with airborne microbes, transforming flat, dense flour into fluffy loaves that lasted longer and digested easier. The entire baking and brewing process became a rhythm of daily life, deeply embedded in Egyptian culture and economy. In fact, fermentation was so essential to Egyptian society that it was ritualized. Beer and bread were offered to the gods, buried with the dead, and immortalized in tomb paintings. The tools used to make them, grinders, ovens, vats, were not only functional but sacred. It's no exaggeration to say that without fermentation, the pyramids might never have been built. Those colossal stones were moved by human hands fueled by fermented grain. So the next time you marvel at the Great Pyramid of Giza, remember, it wasn't just engineering that made it possible. It was microbes, too. While the ancient West was busy brewing beer and baking bread, half a world away in ancient China, a different kind of fermentation revolution was quietly brewing, one rooted in rice, honey, and fruit. Around 6000 BCE, archaeological evidence reveals that early Chinese civilizations were already concocting a fermented elixir that might just be the world's first cocktail. This wasn't a refined drink served in delicate cups, but a potent blend of natural ingredients left to ferment in clay vessels, giving rise to a sweet, tangy, and slightly fizzy beverage that blurred the lines between nourishment, ritual, and celebration. These early Chinese brewers may not have known the science behind fermentation, but they understood its effects, and its potential. This ancient rice-honey fruit mix, found in pottery jars at Jiahu, hints at a deeply intuitive grasp of how nature could transform simple ingredients into something magical. It wasn't just a drink, it was an experience, likely shared during rituals and feasts, bonding communities and elevating social gatherings. But this was only the beginning. As Chinese civilization grew in sophistication, so too did its fermented foods. Over the centuries, a flavorful arsenal of fermented staples emerged, foods that not only preserved ingredients but also amplified their taste and nutritional value. Soy sauce, born from the fermentation of soybeans and wheat, added depth and umami to countless dishes. Fermented black beans, or duchi, offered bold, salty complexity, while vinegar, particularly black vinegar, became a culinary cornerstone with both medicinal and preservative uses. Together, these fermented foods became more than just condiments, they formed the flavorful backbone of Chinese cuisine, shaping its identity and influencing culinary traditions across Asia and beyond. The brilliance of fermentation in China lies not only in its early start but in how deeply it became woven into the fabric of daily life, from humble village kitchens to royal banquets. So, whether sipping a tangy rice brew or seasoning with centuries-old soy sauce, ancient China reminds us that fermentation was never just about survival, it was about refinement, creativity, and cultural identity. Now let's head south, to the lush, vibrant land of ancient India, where fermentation wasn't just a technique, it was a tradition, passed down through generations, woven into the rhythms of daily life, and deeply embedded in the culture's culinary soul. Take curd, known in Tamil as thayer. This simple fermented dairy product, made by letting warm milk naturally sour with wild or cultured bacteria, was, and still is, a staple in Indian households. But curd wasn't just about taste, it was about balance and well-being. Long before the word probiotic entered scientific vocabulary, Indian communities understood that curd soothed the stomach, cooled the body in the hot climate, and helped digestion. It was offered to gods, given to guests, and used to break fasts. It became food, medicine, and symbol, all in one spoonful. And then there's the magic of fermented lentil batters, the base of culinary icons like Dosa and Idli. These dishes, now global favorites, have ancient roots that trace back thousands of years. Made by soaking and grinding rice and urad dal, black gram, then leaving the batter to ferment overnight, this process transformed humble grains into something soft, light, and bursting with subtle tang. It was a stroke of culinary genius, fermentation not only enhanced flavor and texture, but unlocked nutrients, making protein and minerals more bioavailable and easier to digest. In a time before microscopes or microbiomes, Indian cooks were already cultivating thriving colonies of beneficial bacteria in their kitchens. They may not have known the exact science, but they knew the results: better health, longer shelf life, and meals that brought comfort, community, and joy. Today, when we bite into a crispy dosa or soft, steaming idli, we're not just tasting breakfast, we're tasting thousands of years of wisdom, science, and tradition, shaped by the quiet, transformative power of fermentation. Now let's climb high into the Andean highlands of South America, where the air is thin, the mountains majestic, and ancient culinary practices were nothing short of extraordinary. Among the indigenous peoples of the Andes, long before modern food science came into play, fermentation took a uniquely human twist in the form of a traditional corn-based beverage known as chicha. At first glance, chicha might seem like just another fermented drink. But dig a little deeper, and you'll uncover a fascinating, even startling, method of preparation, one that relied not just on natural ingredients, but on human participation in the most literal sense. In its earliest and most traditional form, chicha was made by women who chewed kernels of maize, fresh, starchy corn, and then spat the mash into a communal pot. Sounds strange? Here's why they did it. The enzymes in human saliva, particularly amylase, began breaking down the complex starches in the corn into simpler sugars. This natural enzymatic process was the perfect kickoff for fermentation. The mixture was then left to ferment for several days, transforming into a mildly alcoholic, slightly sour beverage that was rich in carbohydrates, easy to digest, and incredibly important to Andean social life. But chicha was never just a drink. It was a ritual, a cultural connector, and a sacred part of community life. It was offered to gods, shared during festivals, consumed in ceremonies, and served as a symbol of hospitality and togetherness. It united people, both literally and spiritually, through an act of shared labor, tradition, and trust. And yes, it required a serious dedication to both flavor and function. Think about it, before enzymes could be bottled or extracted, ancient Andean communities used their own biology to unlock nutrition, flavor, and social meaning from a humble grain of corn. It's a remarkable example of how humans and microbes have worked together in the most unexpected ways to create culture, both culinary and communal. So the next time you raise a glass of kombucha or craft beer, remember the women of the Andes, spitting into pots, crafting tradition and transformation with every chew. And now we sail across the Mediterranean, to the cradle of Western civilization, ancient Greece and Rome, where the rich aromas of philosophy, politics, and power mixed with something a little fishier. Enter garum, the ancient world's answer to ketchup. But don't let that comparison fool you, garum wasn't sweet or tomato-based. It was a fermented fish sauce, made by layering fish guts, blood, and salt in large vats and letting the mixture sit under the sun for weeks, sometimes even months. What emerged from this pungent alchemy was a golden, umami-rich liquid that the Greeks and Romans simply couldn't get enough of. Garum was everywhere. It was drizzled over meats, mixed into stews, blended with wine, and even used medicinally. Its flavor was complex and intense, adding depth to dishes much like modern soy sauce or Worcestershire. But it wasn't just food, it was a statement. In ancient Rome, garum production became a massive industry. Entire coastal towns specialized in making the highest quality versions, often exporting them across the empire. The finest garum, called garum sociorum, was so prized that it cost more than fine wine. To own and use the best garum was to announce your wealth, taste, and social standing. Inscriptions and mosaics even advertised garum brands, proving that this wasn't just a condiment, it was a symbol of status. And despite its rather bold smell and unconventional ingredients, garum remained a culinary treasure, uniting classes and cultures through flavor. From soldiers to senators, from street vendors to aristocrats, garum was a universal staple, a fermented thread that wove its way through daily Roman life. So, while it may not sound appetizing to us today, garum is a powerful reminder of how fermentation shaped not only what people ate, but how they expressed identity, luxury, and even empire, one fishy drop at a time. And finally, let's journey to the Korean peninsula, where fermentation wasn't just a culinary tradition, it was a lifeline. In a land of distinct seasons, with summers of abundance and winters of scarcity, ancient Koreans developed one of the most iconic fermented foods the world has ever known, kimchi. But kimchi wasn't created for fame or flavor alone. It was born out of necessity, pure, ingenious survival. When the cold months rolled in and the earth froze over, fresh vegetables became scarce, sometimes impossible to find. Without modern refrigeration or supply chains, people had to find a way to preserve the harvest, and fast. That's where fermentation stepped in like a guardian of health and hunger. Kimchi began as a humble method of salting and storing cabbage and radishes underground, often in clay pots called ongi, where the stable, cool temperature allowed fermentation to take its course. With the help of salt, spices, garlic, ginger, and thyme, these vegetables transformed into something greater, a probiotic powerhouse that could nourish a family through an otherwise bleak season. But kimchi was more than just food. It was a ritual, a communal event, and a symbol of resilience. Families would gather each year for kimjang, the traditional kimchi-making season, turning preservation into a shared celebration. Recipes were passed down through generations, with each household developing its own blend of spices, flavors, and secrets. During times of war, occupation, and hardship, kimchi became a quiet form of resistance. Making it, eating it, and preserving it was a way of holding on to identity, culture, and continuity. It connected people to the land, to their ancestors, and to each other. Even today, kimchi remains a national treasure in Korea, not just for its taste, but for its story. So when you see a jar of kimchi on a shelf or a sizzling plate of it served with a meal, remember, that's not just a side dish. That's a legacy of survival, creativity, and cultural pride, fermented one winter at a time. Now it's your turn to stir the pot. We've taken a flavorful journey through ancient kitchens, temples, and taverns. Now we want to hear from you. Out of all the incredible fermented creations we explored, from the frothy beers of Mesopotamia to the bubbling pots of kimchi in Korea, which one would you be bold enough to try? Or maybe you already have a fermented favorite in your modern-day meals. Do you dream of sipping on that rice honey fruit cocktail from ancient China? Would you dare taste a spoonful of Roman garum? Or maybe a steaming dosa with some tangy curd hits close to home? Speech balloon, drop your thoughts in the comments below. Whether it's a fermented food you love, one you want to try, or a historical tidbit that blew your mind, we're all ears. Let's make this a feast of ideas and discoveries. And hey, if your curiosity is still bubbling, why not help us keep this history cooking going? Hit that like button to show some love, and let YouTube know you're hungry for more food history. Your support helps us dig deeper into the past, one bite at a time. Fermented foods are more than just ancient recipes passed down in crumbling scrolls or whispered across generations. They are living testaments to human resilience, ingenuity, and culture. Each jar, crock, or barrel of fermented goodness tells a story. A story of survival in harsh climates. Of families gathering to prepare for a season. Of sacred rituals and spiritual offerings. Of experiments that turned into traditions, and flavors that evolved into foundations of identity. Fermentation is where science meets soul, an art form as much as it is sustenance. These foods did more than nourish the body. They woke people together, to the land they tilled, to the communities they built, and to the ancestors who first dared to let food bubble, bloom, and transform. And incredibly, they continue to connect us across time. So the next time you sip a chilled kombucha, unwrap a wedge of aged cheese, or crunch into a forkful of sauerkraut, pause for a moment. You're not just tasting something delicious, you're tasting thousands of years of human history. If this journey through ancient kitchens and cultural crossroads opened your eyes, and whetted your appetite, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We've got a whole pantry full of stories waiting to be explored, where food meets folklore, science meets spice, and every dish tells a deeper tale. Because here, we believe that every bite comes with a backstory, and every story deserves to be told. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay curious, stay hungry, and keep exploring.